The boat of the Glen Carrig, being an account of their adventures in the strange places of Earth. After the founding of the good ship, the Glen Carrig, through the sinking, striking upon a hidden rock in the unknown seas to the southward, is told by John Winterstraw Gent to his son, James Winterstraw, in the year 1757, and I committed very properly and legibly to manuscript by William Hope Hodgson, 1907. Madre Mia. People may say thou art no longer young, and yet to me thy youth was yesterday. A yesterday that seems still mingled in my dreams. Ah, how the years have o'er thee flung their soft mantilla grey, and e'en to them thou art not over old. How couldst thou be? Thy hair has secretly lost its depth of old glorious dark, and thy face is scarcely lined. No mark destroys its calm serenity, like gold of evening light, when winds scarce stir. The sole light of thy face is pure as prayer. Chapter 1. The Land of Lonesomeness. Now we had been 5 days in the boats, and in all this time made no discovering of land. Then upon the morning of the 6th day came the cry from the boatswain, who had the command of the lifeboat, that there was something which might be land far upon our laboured bow. It was a very low lying, and none could tell whether it was land or a morning cloud. Yet, because there was a beginning of hope within our hearts, we pulled wearily towards it, and thus, in about an hour, discovered it to be indeed the coast of some flat country. And it might be a little after the hour of midday. We are so close to it that it could be distinguished with ease of what manner of land lay beyond the shore. Thus we found it to be of an abominable flatness, desolate beyond all that I could have imagined. Here and there appeared to be covering on clumps of queer vegetation, whether they were small trees or great bushes, I had no means of telling. But this I know, that they were lying unto nothing which I have ever set my eyes on before. So much as this I gathered as we pulled slowly along the coast, seeking an opening whereby we could pass inward to the land. But the weary time had passed on ere and came upon which we sought. Yet in the end, we found it, a slimy banked creek, which proved to be the estuary of a great river, though we spoke of it always as a creek. Into this we entered, and proceeded at no great pace upward along its winding course, and we made forward. We scanned the low banks upon each side, perchance there might be some spot where we could make land, but we found none, the banks being composed of a vile mud which gave us no encouragement to venture rashly upon them. Now, having taken the boat something over a mile of the great creek, we came upon the first of the vegetation which I had chance to notice from the sea. And here, being within some score yards of it, we were the better able to study it. Thus I found there is indeed composed largely of some sort of tree, very low and stunted, and having a what might be described as unwholesome look about it. The branches of this tree I perceived to be the cause of my inability to recognize it from a bush, until I had come close upon it, for they grew thin and smooth throughout their length, and hung towards the earth, being weighted thereto by a single large cabbage-like plant which seemed to sprout off an extreme tip of each. Presently, having passed beyond this clump of vegetation, the banks of the river remaining very low, I stood upon a thwart, and by which means I enabled to scan surrounding country. This I discovered, so far as my sight could penetrate, to be pierced in all directions by innumerable creeks and pools, some of these latter being great to extent, and, as I may before mention, everywhere in the country was low set, as it might be a great plain of mud, so that gave me a sense of dreariness to look out upon it. It may be all unconsciously that my spirit was put in awe by the extreme silence of the country around, for in all the waste I could see no living thing, neither bird nor vegetable, save it be the stunted trees, which indeed grew in clumps here and there all over the land, so much as I could see. The silence, when I grew fully aware of it, was more uncanny, for my memory told me that never before had I come upon a country which contained so much quietness. Nothing moved across my vision, not even a lone bird soared to the dull sky, and for my hearing, not so much as a cry of a seabird came to me. No, nor the croak of a frog, nor the splash of a fish. It was though we had come upon the country of silence, which had some called the land of lonesomeness. Now after 3 hours had passed, whilst we ceased not to labor at the oars, and we could no more see the sea, yet no place fit our feet had come to view, for everywhere mud, gray and black, surrounded us, encompassing a veritability by a slimy wilderness, and so we feigned to pull on, in the hope that we might come ultimately to firm ground. Then, a little before sundown, we halted upon our oars and made a scant meal from a portion of our remaining provisions, and as we ate, I could see the sun sinking over the wastes, and I had some slight aversion in watching the grotesque shadows which it cast from the trees into the water upon our larboard side, for we had come to pause opposite a clump of the vegetation. It was at this time, as I remember, that it was born in upon me afresh how very silent was the land, and that this was not due to my imagination. I remarked that the men on both sides of our own and the bosun's boat seemed uneasy because of it, but none spoke in save of undertones, and though they had fear of breaking it. As at this time, when I was awed by so much solitude, that came the first telling of life in all that wilderness, I heard the first in the far distance, away inland, a curious, low, sobbing note it was, and the rise and fall of it was like to the sobbing of a lonesome wind through the great forest. Yet there was no wind. And then in a moment it had died, and the silence of the land was awesome by reason of the contrast. And I looked about me at the men, both in the boat which was the bosun's commanded, and not one was there but held himself in the posture of listening. In this wise a minute of quietness passed, and then one of the men gave it a laugh, born of the nervousness which had taken them. The bosun muttered him to hush, and in the same moment there came again a blend of what that wild sobbing, and abruptly it sounded away on our right, and immediately was caught up, as it were, and echoed back from some place beyond us, far up the creek. At that, I got me up athwart, intending to take another look over the country about us. But the banks of the creek had become higher. Moreover, the vegetation acted as a screen even to my stature, and elevation enabled me to overlook the banks. And so, after a little while, the crying died away, and there was another silence. And then, as we sat each one harking for what might next befall, George, the youngest prentice boy, who had his seat beside me, plucked me at my sleeve, inquiring in a troubled voice whether I had any knowledge of what that crying might portend. But I shook my head, telling him I had no knowing beyond his own. Though, for his comfort, I said that it might be the wind. Yet, at that, he shook his head, for indeed, it was plain that it could not be done by such agency, for there was a stark calm. Now I had scarce made the end of my remark, when again the crying was upon us. It appeared to come from far up the creek, and from down the creek, and from inland and the land between us and sea. It filled the evening air with a joyful wailing, and I remarked that there was an imperious sobbing, most human and despairful crying, and so awesome was the thing that no man of us spoke, for it seemed that we harked to the weeping of lost souls. And then we waited fearfully. The sun sank below the edge of the world, and the dusk was upon us. And now a more extraordinary thing happened, for as the night fell with a swift gloom, the strange wailing and crying was hushed, and another sound stole out upon the land, a far sullen growling. At first, like the crying, it came from far inland, but is caught up speedily on all sides of us, and presently the dark was full of it, and increased in volume. The strange trumpeting fled across it, then with no slowness it fell away to a low, continuous growling, and in it there was that which I could only describe, an insistent, hungry snarl. I know the word for which I have knowledge so well describes it as that, a note of hunger, most awesome to the ear, and this, more than the rest of those incredible voicings, brought terror to my heart. Now, as I sat listening, George gripped me in suddenly by the arm, declaring in a shrill whisper that something had come among the clumps of trees upon the left bank. Of the truth of this, I had immediately a proof, for I caught the sound of continuous rustling among them, and then a nearer note of growling, as though a wild beast purred at my elbow. Immediately upon this, I caught the bosun's voice calling in a low tone to Josh, the eldest prentice, who had charge of our boat, to come alongside him, for he would have the boats together, and then got we out to the oars and laid the boats together midst the creek. So we watched through the night, being full of fear. So we kept our speech low, that is, so low as to carry our thoughts one to the other through the noise of the barreling. And so the hours passed, and naught happened more than I have told, save that once, a little after midnight, the trees opposite to us seemed to stir again, as though some creature or creatures lurked among them. And then there came a little after that a sound of something stirring in the water against the bank, but it ceased in a while, and the silence fell once more. Thus, after a weariful time away eastwards, the sky began to tell of the coming day. And as the light grew and strengthened, so did the insatiable growling pass hence in the darkened shadows. And so at last came day, and once more there bore to us the sad wailing that had preceded the night. For a certain while it lasted, rising and falling most mournfully over the vastness of the surrounding wastes, until the sun was risen some degrees above the horizon, after which it began to fall, and dying away in lingering echoes, most solemn to our ears. And so it passed, and there again came the silence that had been with us all daylight hours. Now, being day, the bosun bade us to make such sparse breakfast as our provender allowed, after which, having first scanned the banks to discern if any fearful thing were visible, we looked again to our oars and proceeded upon our journey. For we hoped presently to come upon a country where life had not become extinct, and where we could put foot to honest earth. Yet, as I made mentioned earlier, the vegetation, where it grew, did flourish most luxuriantly, so that I am scarce correct when I speak of the life being extinct in that land. For indeed, now I think of it, I can remember the very mud from which sprang seemed veritably to have a flat, sluggish life of its own. So rich and viscid it was it. Presently, it was midday, yet there was little change in the matter surrounding the wastes. Though it may be that the vegetation was something thicker and more continuous along the banks, but the banks were still of the same thick, clinging mud, so that nowhere could we effect a landing. Though we had the rest of the country beyond the banks seemed no better. All while, as we pulled, we glanced continuously from bank to bank, and those who worked not at the oars were fain by rest a hand by their sheathed knives, for the happenings of the past night were continually in our minds, and we were great in fear, so that we had turned back to see, for we had come so nigh to the end of our provisions. Chapter 2, Ship in the Creek. Then, it was nigh on evening when we came upon a creek opening into the greater one of the bank upon our left, which had been like to pass it, as indeed we passed many throughout the day, but that the bosun whose boat had the lead cried out that there was some craft lying up a little beyond the first bend. Indeed, it seemed for one of the mass of her. And indeed, it seemed that one of the masts of her, all jagged where it carried away, stuck up plain to our view. Now having grown sick with so much lonesomeness, and being in fear of the approaching night, we gave something out near a cheer, However, the bosun silent, having no knowledge of those who might occupy the stranger. And so, in silence, the bosun turned. Having grown sick with so much lonesomeness and being in fear of the approaching night, we gave out something near to a cheer, which, however, the bosun silenced, having no knowledge of those who might occupy the stranger. And so in silence the bosun turned his craft towards the creek, where we followed, taking heed to keep quietness, and working the oar warily. So, in a little, we came to the shoulder of the bend, and plain sight of the vessel had come little beyond us. From the distance, she had no appearance of being inhabited, so that after some small hesitations, we pulled her towards her, though still being at pains to keep silence. The strange vessel lay against the bank of the creek, which was upon our right, and over above her was a thick clump of stunted trees, for at the rest she appeared to be firmly embedded in the heavy mud, and there was a certain look of age about her which carried me to a doleful suggestion that we should find naught aboard of her fit for honest stomach. We had come to a distance of maybe 10 fathoms from her starboard bow, for she lay with her head down towards the mouth of the little creek, when the bosun bade his men to go back water, which Josh did regarding our own boat. Then, being ready to fly if we had been in danger, the bosun hailed the stranger, but got no reply, save for some echo of his shout seemed to come back at us. And so he sung out again to her, chance there might be some below deck who had not caught his first hail. But, for the second time, no answer came to us save the low echo not. But that silent trees looked on the little quivering, as though his voice had shaken them. And that, being confident now within our minds, we laid alongside, and in a minute had shinned up the oars, so gained her decks. Here, save the glass of the skylight of the main cabin had been broken, and some portion of the framework shattered, there was no extraordinary litter, so that it appeared to us that she had been no great well abandoned. So soon as the bosun had made his way up from the boat, he turned aft towards the scuttle, and the rest of us following. We found the leaf of the scuttle pulled forward to us within the inch of closing, and so much effort didn't require of us to push it back, and we had intermittent evidence of a considerable time since any had gone down that way. We found the leaf of the scuttle pulled towards to within an inch of closing, and so much effort did not require of us to push it back, that we had intermediate evidence of a considerable time since any had gone down that way. However, it was no great while before we were below, and there we found the main cabin to be empty, except for the bare furnishings. From it were opened off to two staterooms, the fore end, and the captain's cabin in the after parts. And all of those we found matters of clothing and sundries which proved that the vessel had been deserted apparently in haste. In further proof of this, we found in a drawer of the captain's room a considerable quantity of loose gold, the which it would not supposed would have been left by the free will of its owner. Of the storerooms, one upon the starboard side gave evidence that it had been occupied by a woman, no doubt a passenger. The other, in which there were 2 bunks, had been shared. So far we could have any certainty. A couple of young men, and this we gathered by observation of various garments which were scattered carelessly about. Yet, it was not supposed to be that we spent any great time in the cabins, for we pressed for food and made haste, under the directing of the bosun, to discover that the hulk held victuals whereby we might be kept alive. To this end we removed the hatch and led down to the lazarette, and lighting 2 lamps which we had with us in the boats, we went down to make a search. And so, in a little while, we came upon 2 casks which the bosun broke open with a hatchet. These casks were sound, right, and tight, and there was a ship's biscuit, very good and fit for food. At this, as we maybe imagine, we felt ease in our minds, knowing, therefore, that there was no immediate fear for starvation. Following this, we found barrels of molasses, a cask of rum, and some cases of dried fruit. They were moldy and scarce fit to be eaten. A cask of salt beef, another of pork, a small barrel of vinegar, a case of brandy, and 2 barrels of flour, one which proved to be damp-struck, and a bunch of tallow dips. In a little while, we had all these things up in the big cabin, so that we may come at them the better to make choice of which was fit for our stomachs, and that which was otherwise. In the meantime, whilst the bosun overhauled these matters, Josh called a couple of the men and went on to the deck to bring up the gear from the boats, for it had been decided that we should pass the night aboard the hulk. When this was accomplished, Josh took a walk forward to the forecastle, but found nothing beyond 2 seamen's chests, a sea bag, and some odd gear. They were indeed no more than 10 bunks in the place, for she was but a small brig, and had no call for a great crowd. Yet Josh was more than a little puzzled to know what had come to the odd chests, for it was not supposed to be that they had been no more than 2 in a sea bag among 10 men. For to this, at that time, he had no answer, and so, being sharp for supper, made a return to the deck, and thence to the main cabin. Now while he had been gone, the bosun had set the men to clearing out the main cabin, after which had served out 2 biscuits apiece all round, and a tot of rum. To Josh, when he appeared, he gave the same and little. We called a sort of council, being sufficiently stayed by the food to talk. Yet before we came to speech, we made a shift to light our pipes, for the bosun had discovered a case of tobacco in the captain's cabin, and after this we came to consideration of our position. We had a provender, so the bosun calculated to last us for the better part of 2 months, and this without any great stint, but we have yet to prove if the brig held water in her casks, for that in the creek was brackish, even so far as we had penetrated from the sea, else we had not been in need. To the charge of this, the bosun set Josh along with 2 men. Another he told to take charge of the gallery, so long as we were in the hulk, but for that night he said we had no need to do aught, for we had sufficient water in the boat's beakers, and to last us till the morrow. And so, in a little, the dust began to fill the cabin, and we talked on, being greatly content with our present ease and the good tobacco which we enjoyed. In a little while, one of the men cried out suddenly to us to be silent, and in that minute, all heard it. A far drawn-out wailing, the same which had come to us in the evening of the first day. At that we looked one another through the smoke and growing dark, and even as we looked, it became plainer heard, until, in a while, it was all about us. It seemed to become floating down through the broken framework of the skylight, as though some weariful unseen thing stirred and cried upon the decks over our heads. Now, through all the crying, none moved. None, that is, save Josh and the bosun. They went up into the scuttle to see whether anything was in sight, but they found nothing, and came down to us. For there was no wisdom in exposing ourselves, unarmed as we were, save for our sheath knives. And so in a little the night crept down upon the world, and we sat within the dark cabin, none speaking and knowing of the rest only by the glow of their pipes. All at once came the mutter growl, stealing across the land, and immediately the crying was quenched in all sullen thunder. It died away, and there was a full minute of silence. Then once more it came, great fear and uneasiness which had happenings of the first night had bred in me. The taste of the smoke brought me no more pleasure. The muttered growl was swept over our heads, died away into the distance, and there was sudden silence. Then in the quietness came the bosun's voice. He was bidding us haste every one into the captain's cabin. As we moved to obey him, he ran to draw over the lid of the scuttle, and Josh went with him, and together they headed across through with difficulty. When we had come into the captain's cabin, we closed and barred the door, piling two great sea chests up against it. And so we felt near safe, for we knew that nothing, man nor beast, could come at us there. Yet, as May supposed, we felt not altogether secure, for there was that in the growling which now filled the darkness that seemed demonic, and we knew not what horrid powers were abroad. And so the night growling continued, seemingly to be mighty near unto us, aye, almost over our heads, and a loudness far surpassing all that had come upon us the previous night, so that I thanked the Almighty that we had come into shelter in the midst of so much fear. Chapter 3. The Thing That Made Search. Now at times I fell upon sleep, as did most of the others, but for the most part I lay half sleeping and half waking, being unable to attain true sleep by reason of the everlasting growling about us in the night, and the fear which it bred in me. Thus it chanced that after midnight I caught the sound of a man in the main cabin beyond the door, and immediately I was fully waked. I sat me up and listened, and so became aware that something was fumbling about the deck of the main cabin. At that, I got to my feet and made my way to where the bosun lay, meaning to wake him if he slept. But he caught me by the ankle and stooped to shake him, and whispered to me to keep silence, for he too had been aware of the strange noise of something fumbling beyond in the big cabin. In a little while we crept both of us so close to the door as the chest would allow, and we crouched, listening, but could not tell the matter of the thing which produced so strange a noise. for it was neither shuffling nor treading of any kind, nor what it yet was it the whir of a bat's wings, which had first occurred to me, knowing how vampires are said to inhabit the nights and dismal places. Nor yet was it the slur of snakes, but rather it seemed to be though a great wet cloth being rubbed everywhere across the floor in bulkheads. We were the better able to be certain of the truth of this likeness, when suddenly it passed along the further side of the door behind which we listened. At which, you may be sure, we drew backwards, both of us in fright, though the door and chest stood between us and that which rubbed against it. Presently, the sound ceased, and listen as we might, we could no longer distinguish it. Yet until the morning we dozed no more, being troubled in mind as to the matter of the thing that we made search in the big cabin. Then, in time, the day came, and the growling ceased. For a mortal while the sad crying filled our ears, and then at last the eternal silence that fills the day hours of that dismal land fell upon us. So being at last in quietness, we slept, being greatly awearied. And about 7 in the morning the bosun waked me, and I found that he had opened the door into the big cabin. But though the bosun and I made careful search, we could nowhere come upon anything to tell us aught concerning the thing which had put us in such a fright. Yet I know not if I am right in saying that we came upon nothing, for in several places the bulkheads had a chaff look, but whether this had been there then for the night, we had no means of telling. Of that which we heard, the bosun bade me to make no mention, for he could not have the men put in more fear than need be. This I conceived to be wisdom, and so held my peace. Yet I was much troubled in mind to know what manner of thing it was which we had need to fear, and more desired greatly to know whether we should be free of it in the daylight hours. For there was always with me, as I went hither and thither, this thought that it, for that is how it is designated it in my mind, might come upon us to our destruction. Now after breakfast, of which we had each a portion of salt pork, besides rum and biscuit, for by now the fire in the caboose had been set going, we turned to various matters under the directing of the bosun. Josh and 2 of the men made examination of the water casks, and the rest of us lifted the main hatch covers to make inspection of our cargo. But oh, we found nothing, save for 3 feet of water in our hold. By this time, Josh had drawn some water off from the casks, but it was most unsuitable for drinking, being vile smell and taste. Yet the bosun bade him to draw some into the bucket so that the air might haply purify it. But though this was done, and the water allowed to stand through the morning, it was little better. At this, as might be imagined, we were exercised our minds as to the manner to which we should come upon suitable water. But for now, we were beginning to be in need of it. Yet though one said one thing and another said another, no one had wit enough to call to mind any method by which we should be satisfied. Then we had made an end of dining, and the bosun sent Josh with 4 of the men upstream, perchance after a mile or 2, the water should prove sufficient freshness to meet our purpose. That yet they returned a little before sundown, having no water, for everywhere it was salt. Now the bosun, foreseeing that it might be impossible to come upon water, had set the man whom had ordained to be our cook to boiling the creek water in 3 great kettles. This he ordered to be done soon after the boat left, over the spout of each, He hung great pot of iron which filled with cold water from the hold, this being cooler than that from the creek, so that the steam from each kettle pinged upon the cold surface of the hot iron pots, being by the means condensed, was caught in the 3 buckets placed beneath them on the floor of the caboose. In this way enough water was collected to supply us for the evening and the following morning, yet it was a slow method, and we had sore need of a speedier. We were to leave the hull soon, as I, for one, desired. We made our supper before sunset, so as to be free of the crying which reason to expect. After that, the boatswain shut the scuttle, and we went every one of us into the captain's cabin, after we barred the door as the previous night. And well it was for us we acted with this prudence. By the time that we had come into the captain's cabin and secured the door, it was upon sun-setting, and as the dusk came on, so did a melancholy wailing pass over the land. Yet, being by now somewhat inured to so much strangeness, we lit our pipes and smoked. Though I'd observed that none talked, for the crying without was not to be forgotten. Now, as I have said, we kept silence, but this was only for a time, and our reason for breaking it was discovery made by George, the younger apprentice. The lad, being no smoker, was framed to do something away the time, and with his intent he had raked out the contents of a small box, in which he laid upon the deck at the side of the foreign bulkhead. The box had appeared to be filled on some odd lumber, which was part of a dozen or so gray paper wrappers, such as were used, I believe, for carrying samples of corn. Though I had seen them put to other purposes, as indeed was now the case. At first George tossed these aside, but growing darker the bosom lit one of the candles which we had found in the lazarettes. Thus George, who was proceeding to tidy back the rubbish which was cumbering the place, discovered something which caused him to cry out in astonishment. Now, upon hearing George call out, the boatswain bade him to keep silence, thinking it was a piece of boyish restlessness, but George drew the candle to him and bade us to listen, for these wrappers were covered with a fine handwriting after a fashion of a woman's. Even as George told us that he had found, we became aware as the night was upon us, for suddenly the crying ceased, and in the place therefore came out the far distance and low thunder of the night growling that had tormented us through the past 2 nights. For a space we ceased to smoke and sat listening, for it was very fearsome sound, and a very little it seemed to be surrounding the ship, as on the previous nights, but at length, using ourselves to it, we resumed our smoking and bade George to read out to us from the writing upon the paper wrappers. And George, shaking somewhat in voice, began to decipher that which was upon the wrappers. And a strange and awesome story it was, bearing much upon our own concerns. Now, when they discovered the spring among the trees that brook in the bank, there was much rejoicing, for we had become to have such much need of water, and some, being in fear of the ship, declaring because of all of our misfortune and the strange disappearances of their messmates and the brother of my lover, that she was haunted by a devil, declared their intention of taking their gear up the spring, and there making camp. They'd conceived and carried out in space of 1 afternoon, though our captain, a good and true man, begged of them, as they valued life, to stay within the shelter of the living space. Yet, as I remarked, there would be none of them hark to his counseling, and because of the mate and the boatswain were gone, he had no means of compelling them to wisdom. At this point, And George ceased to read and began to rustle among the papers as though he in search for the continuation of the story. Presently he cried out that he could not find it, and the dismay was upon his face, but the bosun told him to read from such sheets as there were left, as he observed, so we had no knowledge if more existed, and we were fain to know further of that spring, which from the story appeared to be over the bank near to the vessel. George, thus being adjured, picked up the topmost sheet, for as they were, as I heard him explain to the bosun, oddly numbered, and having but little reference to one to the other, yet were mightily keen to know even so much as the odd scraps might tell unto us. Whereupon George read from the next wrapper, which ran thus. Now, suddenly I heard the captain cry out that there was something in the main cabin, and immediately my lover's voice calling to me to lock my door, and on no condition to open it. Then the door of the captain's cabin slammed, and there came a silence, and the silence was broken by sound. Now, this was the first time that I had heard the thing make search through the big cabin, but afterwards my lover told me that it had happened before time, and they told me not, fearing to frighten me needlessly, though now I understood why my lover had bidden me never to leave my stateroom door unbolted in the night time. I also remember also wondering if these noises of breaking glass that waked me somewhat from my dreams a night or two previously had been the work of the indescribable thing, for the morning following that night, the glass in the skylight had been smashed. Thus, that as my thoughts wandered to our trifles, while yet my soul seemed to be ready to cleave her to my bosom with fright. I had, by reason of usage, to come to ability to sleep despite the fearsome growling, for I conceived it to cause to be either the mutter of spirits in the night, and had not allowed myself to be unnecessarily frightened with the doleful thoughts, for my lover assured me of our safety, and that we should come to our home, and now beyond my door I could hear the fearsome sound of the thing searching. George came to a sudden pause where the bosun has risen, and put a great hand upon his shoulder. The lad made to speak, but the bosun beckoned him to say no word, and at that we, who had grown to nervousness through the happenings in the story, began everyone to listen, and thus we heard a sound which had escaped us in the noise of the growling without the vessel, and in the interest of the reading, for a space we kept very silent, no man doing more than let a breath go in the trouble in and out of his body, and so each other of us knew that something moved without in the big cabin, and a little something touched upon our door, and it was, as I mentioned earlier, as though a great swab rubbed against the woodwork. At this, the man nearest to the door came backwards in a surge, being put in a sudden fear by the reason of the thing that was so near, with the bosun held up his hand, bidding them, in a low voice, to make no unneedful noise. Yet, as though the sounds of the moving had been heard, the door was shaken with such violence that we waited, everyone expecting to see it torn from its hinges, but it stood, and we hastened to brace ourselves by the means of the blunt boards which placed between it and the two great chests, and upon these we set the third chest so that the door was quite hid. Now I have no remembrance of whether I put down to that what came to the first ship. We had found the stern window of the larboard side to be shattered, but so it was, and the bosun had chosen by means of a teak wood cover which was made to go over it in stormy weather, with stout battens, which were set tight to the wedges. This he had done upon the first night, having fear that some evil thing might come upon us through the opening, and very prudent was the same action of this, as shall be seen. Then George cried out that something was at the corner of the lower bar window, and we stood back growling, ever more fearful because of some evil creature was so eager to come at us. But the bosun was a very courageous man, and calm withal, walked over to close the window and saw that its battens were secure, for he had knowledge sufficient to be sure. If this were so, that no creatures with strength less than that of a whale could break it down, and in such a case its bulk would assure us of being molested. Then even as we made sure of the fastenings, there came a cry of fear from one of the men as they had come at the glass of the broken window, a reddish mass, which blundered up against it, sucking upon it as it were. Then Josh, who was nearest to the table, caught up the candle and held it towards the thing. Thus I saw it had the appearance of many flat things, shape as it might be, out of raw beef. But it was alive. At this we stared, everyone being too bemused with terror to ought to protect ourselves, even had we been possessed of weapons. And at this remained thus an instant like silly sheep waiting at the butcher. I heard the framework creak and crack. There was ran splits along the glass. In another moment the whole thing would have been torn away, and the cabin undefended. But the bosun, with a great curse at us for our deliberate lack of use, seized the other cover and clapped it over the window. At that there was more than help could be made to avail, and the battens and wedges were in place in a trice. That was so no sooner accomplished than need be. We had immediate proof, for this came our rendering of wood and a splintering of glass. And after that, a strange yowling out in the dark. The yelling rose up and drowned the continuous growling that filled the night. In a little, it died away, and a brief silence seemed to ensue. We heard a slobby flumbling at the teak cover, but it was well secured, and we had no immediate cause for fear. Chapter 4. The Two Faces. Of the remainder of that night, I have but a confused memory. At times we heard the door shaken behind the great chest, but no harm came to it. In odd whiles there was a soft thudding and rubbing around upon the decks over our heads. And once, as I recollect, the thing made a final try at the teak covers across the windows. But the day came at last and found me sleeping. Indeed, we had slept beyond noon, but that the bosun, mindful of our needs, waked us and removed the chests. Yet perhaps the space of a minute none durst open the door until the bosun bade us descend to one side. We faced about at him, then saw that he held a great cutlass in his right hand. He called to us that there were 4 more weapons, and he made backward motion with his left hand towards the open locker. At that, as we might be supposed, we made haste to the place which he pointed and found that, among some other gear, there were 3 more weapons, such as he held, but the 4th was a straight cut and thrust. This I had good fortune to secure. Being now armed, we ran to join the bosun. For this he had opened the door and was scanning the main cabin. I would remark how good a weapon doth seem to put the heart in a man. For I, who knew short hours before feared for my life, was now right full of lustness in a fight, in which mayhap was no matter for regret. From the main cabin, the bosun led up to the deck, and I remember some surprise of finding the lid of the scuttle even as we left in the previous night. But then I recollected that the skylight was broken, and there was access to the big cabin that way. Yet I questioned myself as to what matter the thing could be which ignored the convenience of the scuttle, and descended by way of a broken skylight. We made search of the decks and forecastle, found nothing, and after that the boatswain stationed 2 of us on guard whilst the rest went such duties that were needful. In a little we came to breakfast, and after that we prepared to test the story upon the sample wrappers and see perchance whether there was indeed a spring of fresh water among the trees. Now between the vessel and the trees lay a slope of thick mud, against which the vessel rested. To have scrambled up the bank and been next to the impossible, by reason of its fat richness, for indeed it looked fit to crawl. But that Josh called out to the boatswain that he came upon a ladder, lashed across the forecastle's head. This was brought, also several hatch covers. The latter were placed first upon the mud, and the latter laid upon them, by which means were enabled to pass upon to the top of the bank without contact with the mud. Here we entered at once among the trees, where they grew right up to the ledge, but we had no trouble in making way, for they were nowhere close together, but standing rather each one in a little open space by itself. We had gone a little way among the trees when suddenly one who was with us cried out that he could see something away on our right, and we clutched everyone his weapon with more determinedly, and went towards it. Yet it proved to be out of a seaman's chest. In a space further off we discovered another, and so after a little walking we found the camp. But there was small semblance of a camp about it, for which the sail of which the tent had been formed was all torn and stained, and lay muddily upon the ground. Yet the spring was all we had wished, clear and sweet, and so we knew what we might dream of deliverance. Now upon the discovery of the spring, it might be thought that we should set up a stout to those upon the vessel, but this was not so, for there was something in the air of the place which cast a gloom upon our spirits, and we had no disinclination to return unto the vessel. Upon coming to the brig, the boatswain called to 4 men who go down into the boats and pass up the breakers. Also, he collected the old buckets belonging to the brig, and forthwith each of us set our work. Some, those with weapons, entered into the wood and gave down the water to those stationed upon the bank, and these in turn passed it to those in the vessel. To the main and the galley, the boatswain gave command to fill a boiler with some of the most select pieces of pork and beef from the casks, and get them cooked so soon as might be. And so we were kept at it, and for had been determined, now that we had come upon water, that we should stay not an hour longer in that monster-ridden craft, and we were all agog to get the boats revictualled and put back to sea, from which we had too gladly escaped. So we worked through all that remainder of the morning, and right into the afternoon, for we were in mortal fear of the coming dark. Towards 4 o'clock the boatswain sent the man who had been set to do our cooking up to us with slices of salt meat upon the biscuits, and we ate as we worked, washing our throats with water from the spring. And so, before the evening, we had filled our breakers, and near every vessel which was convenient for us to take in the boats. More, some of us snatched the chance to wash our bodies, for we're sore with brine, having dipped in the sea to keep down thirst as much as we might be. Now, though it had not taken us so great a while to finish our watering carrying, if that matters had been more convenient, yet the softness of the ground at our feet, and the care which we had picked our steps, and some of the some little distance between us and the brig. It had grown later than we desired before we got made an end. Therefore, when the bosun sent word that we should come aboard and bring our gear, we all made haste. Thus, as it chanced, I found that I had left my sword beside the spring, having placed it there to have two hands for carrying one of the breakers. At my remarking my loss, George, who stood near, cried out that he would run for it, and was gone in a moment, being greatly curious to see the spring. Now, at this moment, the bosun came up and called for George, but informed him that he had been run to the spring to bring me my sword. At this, the bosun stamped his foot and swore a great oath, declaring that he had kept the lad by him all day, having the wish to keep him away from any danger which the wood might hold, and knowing the lad's desire to see adventure there. At this, a matter which I should have known, I reproached myself for so gross a piece of stupidity, and hastened after the bosun, who had disappeared over the top of the bank. I saw his back as he passed into the wood, and I ran until I was up with him, for suddenly, as it were, I found a sense of chilly dimness that had come among the trees, though a while before the place had been full of warmth of the sun. This I put to the count of the evening, which was drawing on pace, and also it must be borne in mind that there were but the two of us. We came to the spring, but George was not to be seen, and I saw no sign of my sword. At this, the bosun raised his voice and cried out the lad's name, what he called, and again. Then the second shout, we heard the boy's shrill halloo from the distance ahead among the trees, and at that we ran towards the sound, plunging heavily across the ground, which was everywhere covered with thick scum, and clogged the feet in walking. As we ran, we hallooed, and coming upon the boy, I saw that he had my sword. The bosun ran towards him and caught him by the arm, speaking with anger and commanding him to return with us immediately to the vessel. But the lad, for no reply, pointed with my sword, and saw that he pointed at what appeared to be a bird against the trunk of one of the trees. This, as I moved closer, I perceived to be part of the tree, and no bird. But it was a very wondrous liken to a bird, so much that I went up to it to see if my eyes had deceived me. It seemed no more than a freak of nature, the most wondrous in its fidelity, but being an excrescence upon the trunk, when a sudden thought that it would make me a curio, I reached upon to whether I could break it away from the tree, but it above my reach, so I had to leave it. Yet one thing I discovered, for in stretching towards the protuberance that I had my hand upon the tree, and its trunk was soft as pulp under my fingers, much after the fashion of a mushroom. As we turned to go, the bosun inquired of George's reasons for going beyond the spring, and George told him he had seemed to hear someone calling to him among the trees, and that there had been much pain in the voice as he ran towards it, but being unable to discover its owner, and immediately afterwards had seen the curious bird-like excrescence upon the tree nearby. Then we had called, and the rest we had knowledge. We had come so nigh to the spring on our return journey that some low whine seemed to run along the trees. I glanced towards the sky and realized that the evening was upon us. I was about to remark upon this to the bosun when suddenly abruptly came to a stand and bent forward to stare into the shadows at our right. At that, George and I turned ourselves to perceive what the matter. It was which I had attracted the attention of the bosun. Thus we made out the tree 20 yards away, which had all its branches wrapped around its trunks, made a lash of whip as it wound its stalk. Now it seemed a very strange sight as we made all but toward it, to learn the reason of such extraordinary happening. Yet, when we had come close to it, had no means of arriving to knowledge of which pretend, but walking around the tree, were more astonished at our circumnavigation of the great vegetable than before. Be right back. Bathroom break. Apologies. Yet it was come close upon it. We had no means of arriving at the knowledge which had pretended, but walked each around the tree, and we were more astonished at our circumnavigation of the great vegetable than before. Now, suddenly and in the distance, I caught the far wailing that came before the night, and abruptly, as it seemed to me, the tree wailed at us, and I was astonished and frightened yet. Though as I retreated, I could not withdraw my gaze from that tree, but scanned it more intently, and suddenly I saw a brown, human face peering at us from between the wrapped branches. At this, I stood very still, being seized with fear which renders one shortly incapable of movement. And then, before I had possession of myself, I saw that it was a great part of the trunk of the tree, for I could not tell where it ended and the tree began. Then I caught the bosom by the arm and pointed, for whatever it was a part of the tree or not, it was a work of the devil. But the bosun, upon seeing it, ran straightway so close to the tree that he might have touched it with his hand, and I found myself beside him. Now George, who was on the bosoms of the side, whispered that there was another face, not unlike to a woman's, and indeed, so soon as I perceived it, I saw that the tree had a second excrescence, most strangely after the face of a woman. Then the bosom cried out with an oath at the strangeness of the thing, and I felt the arm which I held shake somewhat, as it might be with a deep emotion. Then far away I heard again the sounds of the wailing, and immediately, from among the trees about us, there came an answering wails with a great sighing, and before I had time to be more than aware of these things, the tree wailed again at us, and at that the bosom cried out suddenly that he knew through of what it was that he knew. I had no time to knowledge, and immediately he began with his cutlass to strike at the tree before us, and to cry upon God to blast it. And lo, at his smiting, a very fearsome thing happened, for the tree did bleed like any living creature. Thereafter a great yowling came from it and began to writhe, and suddenly I became aware that all the trees around us were aquiver. Then George cried out and ran upon my side of the bosom, and I saw that one of the great cabbage-like things pursued him upon its stem, and even as an evil serpent, dreadful as it was, for it became blood-red in color, and I smote it with the sword, which I had taken from the lad, and it fell to the ground. Now from the brig I heard them howling, and the trees become more like live things, and there was a vast growling in the air, and hideous trumpetings. Then I came to the bosom again by the arm, and shouted to him that we must run for our lives, and thus we did, smiting with our swords as we ran, for the things came at us out from the growing dusk. Thus we made the brig, and the boats being ready, I scrambled aboard after the bosom onto his, and we put straightway on into the creek, all of us, pulling with so much haste that as our loads would allow. And as we went, I looked back at the brig, and it seemed unto me that a multitude of things hung over the bank above her, and they seemed to flicker things moving hither and thither aboard her, and we were in the great creek up which we had come, and so, in a little, it was night. All that night we rowed quickly, very strictly to the center, keeping very strictly to the center of the big creek, and all about us bellowed the vast growling, becoming more fearsome than I ever had heard it, until it seemed to me that we had waked all that land of terror to a knowledge of our presence. But when the morning came, so good a speed as we made that we, without fear, and the current being with us, that we were nigh upon the open sea, where each one of us raised a shout, feeling like freed prisoners. And so, full of thankfulness to the Almighty, we rode outward to sea. Thank you, everyone who popped in tonight. Tomorrow we'll get another full couple chapters done. But anyway, rest well tonight. Take care.